morning, everybody. It's 8:30, so we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar in our mandatory reporting series. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the lands I'm calling in from today, the lands of the Wadawurrung people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining us from virtually. So please feel free to share in the chat where you're calling in from. And I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and acknowledge their ongoing connections to the skies, lands, and waterways throughout Australia. So just quickly before we get started, who are we? Anthesis is the world's leading purpose-driven, digitally enabled, science-based activator and the largest group of sustainability experts globally. We help companies strategically reduce emissions, navigate sustainability frameworks and regulation, address human rights issues, and plan for climate-related risks and opportunities. Some of you online may remember us from our former company, Endeavour Environmental, which operated as a leading climate change and sustainability consultancy from 2010 to this year when we rebranded as Anthesis, a fellow B Corp, which we're very proud to be. Today you're going to be hearing from myself briefly. I'm Hannah. I lead our ESG and mandatory reporting business line. From Lucy, one of our principal consultants and our expert in all things climate risk. She leads our climate risk service line. And Julian Sue. Julian is a senior consultant with us and works closely with Lucy, the two of them supporting many clients progress through climate risk assessments with TCFD and now the ASRS all the way through to disclosure. We also have some of our other colleagues on the line, Amy, who you met last month, who leads our mandatory reporting service line to help when we get to Q&As if there's any curly questions you guys have. Just before we get into it, today we're going to do a quick deep dive into mandatory climate-related financial reporting. This is the second part of our series, as I mentioned. I'm wanting to offer you guys some valuable guidance and actionable insights for identifying climate risks, opportunities, and navigating scenario analysis. The team are going to talk through the process and just noting that this is a complex topic and our aim is to try and demystify it as much as we can for you in the next 30 minutes. So as we go through, please add any questions to the Q&A button, which is up the top, or into the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end, and if we don't, we'll follow up with an email and answer them for you there. Just to note, this is being recorded and you'll all get a copy of the slides afterwards and a link. There's also a couple of interactive polls that the team have put in, so please feel free to get involved. So let's get started. I'll hand over to Lucy.
Great. Thanks, Hannah, and morning, everyone. So we're going to start today by just going and giving a bit of an overview of the topic before really delving into a typical assessment process and also touching on what this means for disclosure mapping as you prepare for the upcoming requirements. But kind of starting with the bigger picture, in today's rapidly evolving world, understanding climate-related risks and opportunities is crucial for all businesses. And whilst climate-related trends are continually evolving, they broadly fall into two categories. The first is the net zero transition. So that is the significant economy-wide changes needed to mitigate climate change and transition to a low-carbon economy. And the second is physical climate change, which is the widespread and irreversible impacts to the physical climate and environment from things such as extreme heat through to sea level rise and also extreme events such as bushfires and flooding. Both of these can result in threats to everyday business activities, including the possibility of regulators or investor divestment, things such as reputational risks or seeing increasing financial costs. It's therefore key for businesses to understand how these key trends may evolve in the future and how they actually have the potential to impact businesses across the economy. So today, we are seeing companies facing an increasing pressure from regulators to disclose climate-related risks and opportunities. And this shift is really transforming expectations and the business landscape, requiring companies to understand its implications both now, but also out to the future. Here in Australia, we see that the primary driver is preparing for and aligning with the upcoming Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ASRS. And whilst compliance with these standards is crucial, their broader purpose really is to encourage businesses to build resilience in response to climate change. So, initiating this process not only prepares you for these standards, but also enables you to incorporate climate related outcomes into things such as financial metrics and strategic considerations. And it's really essential to start testing different plausible future scenarios to inform those business decisions and therefore enhance your longer term planning. Additionally, there's things such as integrating climate risk and opportunity assessments into your existing risk management processes, and that's key. This approach really ensures a comprehensive view of how climate factors impact your business, aligns with those regulatory requirements, and supports more informed decision making. So essentially, by proactively addressing these elements, you can not only be ready to meet those regulatory expectations, but also start to gain a competitive edge and demonstrate leadership in sustainability. And embracing these changes will really help position your company for success in this evolving space. So, although I'm sure all of us on the call recognize, as well as more broadly across the economy, that climate change is one of the biggest risks facing the world today, actually understanding its exact impact on businesses does remain a challenge. We therefore look to climate scenario analysis as a crucial tool for exploring, assessing, and preparing for climate related issues. It involves examining how future climate changes could impact your business operations, finances, markets, and so on. And by doing so, it helps you develop strategies to mitigate potential impacts and build your resilience. Given the uncertainty around how climate change will evolve, scenario analysis allows businesses to explore multiple possible futures, which might diverge significantly from today's business as usual state. And this approach helps identify and prepare for a range of those potential outcomes, which enhances your ability to adapt amid these changing conditions that we're all facing. In the context of the ASRS, scenario analysis is a critical component. It supports the assessment and also the disclosure of climate related risks and opportunities, ensuring that your reporting is thorough and aligned with the regulatory expectations.
So now that Lucy's provided some background information on some of the drivers for climate risk assessment and explained what scenario analysis is, we thought we would provide you with some information on what a typical assessment process looks like. For a company assessing climate-related risks and opportunities for the very first time, a typical process contains more or less 5 steps. Firstly, identifying climate-related risks and opportunities. Secondly, defining the scope of the assessment. Thirdly, selecting physical and transition scenarios, as well as time horizon. Fourthly, assessing the identified risks and opportunities using scenario, as well as other data collected. And fifthly, and finally, preparing for disclosure. And we'll now touch on each of these items in a little bit more detail. Before touching on how to identify climate-related risks and opportunities, firstly, some quick definitions. So climate-related risks and opportunities refer to the potential impacts that climate change and trends can have on organizations and economies, as well as the potential benefits that may arise from addressing these impacts. They can be separated into certain types and categories, as outlined on this slide. Physical risks are the result of changes in the physical climate, and there are 2 main types. Firstly, chronic, which result from longer-term changes in climate patterns such as temperature and sea level, and acute, which are short-term, intense events such as flooding, bushfires, or storms. Transition risks and opportunities arise from the shift towards a lower carbon economy, and they can include regulatory changes, for example, carbon pricing, technological advances, so we're thinking things like renewable energy technologies, market shifts, for example, changing consumer preferences, as well as reputational risks, so for example, the public perception of a company's environmental impact. Opportunities then on the right-hand side range from resource efficiency and energy sources to new products and services, shifts in markets and in consumer preferences, and finally, opportunities to increase a company's resilience to climate-related risks. This categorization of the different risks and opportunities actually also assists with their identification, as it provides a really helpful framework for companies at this early stage to consider that full range of risks and opportunities that may be relevant to their business activities, so that they can go through category by category to ensure that all relevant risks and opportunities are identified and considered. At this early stage, reference to external sources such as peer disclosures and other industry guidance, as well as technical expertise, is also helpful. So, after starting with that framework, what else does a company require to identify and assess its climate-related risks and opportunities? We thought we'd make this presentation a little bit more interactive early in the morning. So at this stage, I'd like to pause quickly and take a quick poll to check your understanding of this question. What does an entity need to start identifying and assessing climate-related risks and opportunities? I'll give you a moment just to submit an answer. Thanks for everyone who responded. I can see that it's fairly almost unanimous that most people have selected all of the above. And that is correct. There's a significant amount of different sources and different types of information that are required for a climate risk assessment, and we will touch on all of these now, as well as some other considerations. So a first consideration in this process is to consider the scope of the assessment. For example, which aspects of your company's value chain are being assessed? And here you might wish to complete an exercise to understand the financial materiality of value chain components. So the assessment really focuses in on those material components of your value chain. In addition, the depth of the assessment is impacted by whether risks and opportunities are being assessed qualitatively or also quantitatively. The ASRS, the new mandatory disclosure standards, require qualitative assessment in the first year of disclosure. Quantitative assessment is not prescribed. Whether it's completed or not will actually depend on a company's circumstances. So, for example, if it has the skills and resources to conduct that assessment, as well as the materiality of particular risks and opportunities. And this is reflected in the quoted ASRS requirement below on the slide, which explicitly takes into account a company's circumstances in considering what a reasonable approach to a climate risk assessment is. This initial scoping exercise will help to inform the stakeholders and the information required to complete the assessment. Typically, a broad range of stakeholders who oversee functions which all touch on climate risk will be involved, and their inclusion will ensure that the assessment incorporates the knowledge of different parts of a company, as well as ensuring that it is integrated with a company's broader processes, so financial reporting, risk management, and business strategy. And on this point, please note that Anthesis will soon be releasing an article on LinkedIn, on our website, on roles and responsibilities for reporting under the ASRS. Data will also be required to complete the assessment, and this falls into two main buckets. There's business data all across the value chain, as well as climate data, which includes both historical and projected data.
Now for another poll, keeping it nice and interactive this morning. So now we just want to ask you which of the three options here closest align with the definition of climate change scenarios. Again, we'll give you a couple of moments. We've got option 1 of forecasts of future weather patterns, option 2 of representations of plausible climate futures, or option 3 being predictions of future greenhouse gas emission levels in the atmosphere. Great. So again, I think we see the majority choosing option 2, which is correct, the representations of plausible climate futures. So before we get stuck into discussing how to use scenarios to assess climate-related risks and opportunities, we thought it was worth just actually making sure that there's a clear understanding of what climate scenarios actually are. So in simple terms, a climate scenario is a description of a possible future state of the world based upon different assumptions about factors such as greenhouse gas emissions, technological advancements, and socio-economic developments, just to name a few. It's important to note that a climate scenario is not a forecast, and instead each scenario is a representation of those possible pathways of how the future could unfold. This does mean that there is an inherent level of uncertainty in scenarios, and that is something to be aware of and to consider when using them for analysis. There's quite a few things to factor in when actually choosing climate scenario data, and that includes considering the specific scenarios and time horizons that you focus on in your analysis. One key perspective to start with is ensuring that the selection of the scenarios meets the minimum expectations as set out within the draft ASRS. In its current form, the standards require an entity to disclose its assessment against at least 2 possible future states. One of these to be consistent with the Paris Agreement global temperature goals set out in the Climate Change Act 2022, which is pursuing efforts to limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's important to note here that the draft requirements expect a minimum of 2, and part of this process for companies is to be aware that there are also other judgments involved to select what is most useful and relevant to your business. It's crucial when selecting scenarios to make sure that they are distinct enough to highlight major strategic differences and to capture the most relevant nuances for your organization. And whilst the draft standards mandates a minimum of 2, in some instances, including a third could provide a broader perspective for many businesses. And this is actually something that we've seen to be mandated in the recent New Zealand requirements. And there is an expectation that in the final version of the ASRS, there may be greater clarity provided on this topic. In addition to the reporting requirements, there are then a number of technical considerations, and these may actually evolve as your organization progresses in this area of assessing climate-related risks and opportunities. These include things such as the geographical coverage of the data. So, for example, are your operations and broader value chain primarily located in one country and therefore would benefit from using more localized data sets? Or is the value chain spread across multiple regions and therefore requires data that be compared and analysed across these different locations? Also thinking about how there are actually different data sets required to understand the different types of trends. I see we have a question about the IPCC data, and typically that data would be used to look at the physical climate trends and therefore help to understand the physical climate risks. Whereas there are other data sources that may focus on looking at trends that relate to that transition to a low carbon economy. There are also other things to consider, such as how detailed does the data need to be depending on how evolved you are in this space. For an initial assessment, for someone that has a large portfolio, for example, the focus may be making sure that data is consistent and can be used to then identify priority areas to do further assessment. Whereas if you are more advanced in this space, you may be looking for more detailed data outputs that would then help you to integrate into things such as your financial considerations and your broader business processes. There are other things highlighted here in terms of selecting your scenarios and time horizons. So that's things such as making sure there is alignment between scenarios when you are looking at those different types of trends, and also both internal and external considerations when selecting the relevant time horizons. If we then take into consideration all of the different components and factors that Julian and I have discussed here this morning, we just thought it would be useful to go through a quick example of a qualitative assessment. Here we're focusing on an example physical risk, and the example is a fictitious food and beverage company that has global manufacturing operations. This example here is looking at the potential for the company's manufacturing operations to be impacted as a result of extreme rainfall flooding. There are a number of key factors and questions to sort of ask and analyze when doing this type of qualitative assessment, starting with things such as what part of the business could be impacted from this risk or opportunity. Here, as I mentioned, the focus is the manufacturing operations, but in other instances, there could be a focus on parts of the supply chain and logistics, or focusing on sources of particular materials or products. The driver here is focusing on extreme rainfall events. A key thing also to highlight is that there may be several risks when you do this exercise that could have similar impacts or outcomes to the business, but will have differing drivers, and therefore it is useful to assess them separately. Once you've then got the focus of the risk, it's then looking towards the potential impact, what type of impact, and also within that, making sure there's a consideration of the type of financial impact. Here, noting that there could be different types of financial impact, being things such as your operating expenditure, or even needing more capex to replace equipment or infrastructure that might be damaged from a type of event like this. Then, if you actually think about how the assessment is framed when you are analysing these risks or opportunities, there are several ways to do it. One option is actually to use existing components of your broader risk management framework, as that allows easier integration into your broader business processes, but also is something that stakeholders in your business might be more familiar with, so therefore get an understanding. There might also be other methods out there in terms of assessing at this qualitative stage. The key thing I think overall to take away from this is that the analysis should not only focus on what are these scenarios projecting in terms of the change in the trend and the risk or the opportunity, but also making sure you contextualize this within the context and the way that your business operates, and therefore trying to focus on how that impact may unfold for you.
Thanks, Lucy. And I'm just seeing that there's a couple of questions coming through about scenario analysis. We've got about 5 more minutes of content, and if we have time, we'll swing back to answer a few of those. Touching on disclosure, though, as mentioned earlier, a key driver for these assessments is the upcoming mandatory disclosure regime. So accordingly, once a climate risk assessment has been conducted, a reporting company will need to ensure that it meets disclosure requirements. Before we touch on some of the disclosure mapping considerations, one final question, just so we can understand where you're sitting here. Has your company publicly disclosed on climate risk and opportunity assessments before, for example, in a TCFD disclosure or in a sustainability report? You can see there's a pretty even split here, almost 50-50 companies that have disclosed and those that have not yet disclosed. So for those that have not yet disclosed, this will be particularly useful for you. For those that have, who are transitioning, for example, from a TCFD aligned disclosure to compliance with the ASRS, hopefully this will provide some insight for you as well. So following the internal identification and assessment of climate-related risks and opportunities, this final step, external disclosure. And so generally, internal assessment documents will have additional information in them. So this might include information relating to the assessment itself. We're thinking here detailed scenario data or scenario modeling undertaking as part of a quantitative scenario analysis, or perhaps about, as Lucy was just saying, about the integration of climate risk assessment with existing company risk management frameworks, or even internal information allocating responsibility or ownership to certain individuals or departments. Not all of this information may be required to be disclosed, but instead external disclosure should be focused on meeting disclosure requirements in the ASRS. This will involve an assessment of all the different requirements in the ASRS to identify reporting requirements, as well as identifying any gaps that your company may have, and if necessary, developing an action plan to ensure those gaps are filled by the mandated time, depending on which reporting group your company falls into. A further consideration here is materiality. Under the ASRS, an entity shall disclose material information about climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect its prospects. So not every single identified risk and opportunity must be disclosed, only those considered material. It's a bit of a vexed topic at the moment, and part 5 of our series on mandatory reporting will actually cover how to assess materiality of climate-related risks and opportunities. So if you're looking for additional guidance on this point, please make sure to tune into that. There's also provision within the ASRS which provides an exemption in relation to the disclosure of information related to opportunities in particular, which is deemed commercially sensitive. And there are limited circumstances in which this applies, and they are also specified in the standards. And finally, for more practical examples, although it's a couple of years old now, the TCFD Good Practice Handbook, which is available for free online, contains real examples of company disclosures in various industries, as well as guidance on why that was a good disclosure. And that can really provide some guidance for you on what a good practice disclosure looks like. And to round out this presentation, a few quick takeaways. Firstly, identifying and planning for climate-related risks and opportunities. It's not only something that's required by the new upcoming mandatory disclosure requirements, it's good business practice. It does take time to do well, so we recommend starting now, even if you're not required to disclose until, for example, Group 2 or Group 3 in several years' time. You should align the process with your existing risk management frameworks for that ease of integration and implementation. Lucy spoke to the different scenarios to choose from before. The draft standards require a minimum of 2 scenarios at this stage. Only material risks and opportunities are required to be disclosed. And finally, this is a whole of business process. So bringing stakeholders on the journey from the very beginning will ensure more buy-in and better outcomes.
Thanks, Lucy and Julian. Hopefully that's helped everyone give a bit of a deeper understanding on the climate risk and opportunity process under these new standards. There are a few questions coming in. I'll just give you a moment to post some more and give a little plug to our upcoming sessions in this webinar series. So next month, we're going to do a deep dive on Scope 3 emissions. And that's a complex topic that everyone gets excited about. I mean, we do, but we do it all the time, so it might not be as, well, it's exciting for everyone, hopefully. Then looking at breaking down climate transition planning, which is a new requirement. As Julie mentioned before, we're going to have one focusing on materiality, because there's a few nuances there with the new standards. And then lastly, on effective reporting strategies. But as I mentioned last time, if anyone has any requests for topics that they'd like us to cover, please reach out with them. There were a couple of questions. I don't know, Julian or Lucy, do you want to talk a bit more on the different scenarios that are under physical and transition and how we look at them, which was a bit earlier up?
Yeah, of course. Happy to explain this a bit more. So as I mentioned, there are different providers of data when looking at those scenarios, and the requirements to have those 2 scenarios, and including that one that aligns with the global average temperature of the 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's relevant for both looking at your physical risks, but also looking at your transition risks and opportunities. So when going through that process, it may be a case of looking at at which scenarios from a transition perspective you might pick. And there are several providers that you might look at. There are things such as the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, or the NGFS, was the Network for Green Financial Systems. Then on the physical side, it might be things from the IPCC, as we previously mentioned, but more than happy to take that off as well and talk about it in more detail. We're right on 9 a.m.
We are. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy your day. Hope to see you next time. And yeah, please reach out with any other questions and we'll add them into the answers when we send this out. So, thanks. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.